In 1991, Richard Dawkins introduced one of the most enduring analogies in the atheist world with his online essay, Viruses of the Mind. In it, he presented religion, among other things, as a mental virus, noting that it would persist despite conferring no survival advantage. And this provided for an interesting new way of examining religious phenomenon, and that was heartily embraced by the atheist community. Dawkins and Dan Dennett expanded on the concept in the early years of the New Atheist movement, and friend of the show Darrell Ray expanded it out to an entire book in his 2009 work, The God Virus. But there's a big problem with this analogy that gets insufficient attention, in my opinion. Hell, one might even call this problem a fatal flaw. See, despite all the ink that's been spilled in the opposite direction, religion does confer a survival advantage both historically and today. Now, there are several different ways to argue for a historical survival advantage in religion. You know, it would improve social cohesion. It would make it easier to fire up the tribe for a fight. Thoughts of an afterlife might make them more willing to fight. Yeah, religion protects societal norms against socially detrimental behavior. There's a lot of directions to go, but in the modern day, most of those fall away. Today, religion works against social cohesion, in a statewide civilization. There are remarkably few times when fighting is to society's advantage today, and we have laws, judges, and cops to protect against socially detrimental behavior. But there is still one survival advantage that religion has, and to see it, all you have to do is find an atheist couple and a super religious one and ask them how many kids they have. And if you don't have a random sampling of religious and non-religious families handy to do the test, we can also just look at Pew Research Center's data. According to the 2015 data, which was the most recent I could find, Christian families in the U.S. have 2.2 kids on average. Nuns have 1.7. Now, that might not seem like a huge difference, but keep in mind that it means that the average Christian couple leaves more humans than they started with, and the average atheist couple doesn't, right? We get reduced by 0.3, they get increased by 0.2. And the numbers get more stark when you start looking at it by specific religion. When you look at self-identified atheists, the number goes down slightly to 1.6. And when you look at just Mormons, the number skyrockets to like 3.5 kids per couple. What's more, the numbers move along a spectrum with the religiosity. The more religious you are, the more kids you have. People who say religion is important to them have 25% more kids than people who say it isn't. I mean, sure, I guess at a certain point of religiosity, become a celibate priest or something, and then the term having kids takes on a whole new meaning. Of course, I'm still willing to bet the average is still up from 2.2. It's also worth noting that this basically holds true across all the major religions. Now, I say basically because it's hard to find numbers on Buddhism, and there aren't enough American Buddhists for the Pew to get good data on that. Buddhist majority countries vary wildly in terms of culture, and it's a hard one to pin down. But with Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, all of them show this same trend. The more pious you are, the more children you have. And honestly, if we don't acknowledge that, it gets really hard to explain why religious people continue to exist at all. Right? Religious people lose their religion way more often than non-religious people find God. And even when non-religious people do become religious, they very rarely become conservatively religious. Right? Like an atheist raised in a non-religious home might decide they're Christian one day, but they're far more likely to join some like Jesus-light liberal church that ordains women and keeps its homophobia hidden. They're not super likely to join the Westboro Baptist Church. So if they weren't having more kids than us, they'd just logically disappear through attrition, right? And as obvious as this may seem to anybody who's ever been to a Walmart in the Bible Belt, it's all but ignored in the atheist literature about mind viruses. And this is not something we can afford to ignore. Hell, it's the main reason our atheism show has to carve out a dedicated segment every week for the misogyny news. It's the reason Heath, Eli, and I had to go to theaters and watch a horror movie about the abortionist under your bed last weekend. It's the reason grown men gather in Rome and earnestly argue that the Jesus bread won't turn into magical human flesh right if you use a lady wizard. Religions, the successful ones at least, always seek to control the means of reproduction. Their sexual taboos, their inordinate hard-on for families, their disempowerment of women, these things all work together to ensure that women can be reduced to Christian factories. And when they're not feeling particularly subtle, they'll just say shit like be fruitful and multiply, or start things like the Quiverful movement with the expressly stated goal of outbreeding the secularists. And if we want to understand their goals or their means of empowerment, we have to fully reckon with that. And when we reduce religions to a mental virus, we're in real danger of overlooking the Darwinian process that keeps religion around. And by the way, nothing I'm saying here should be taken as a critique of Daryl Ray's book, The God Virus. Daryl is no stranger to the religious goal of leading society around by the uterus, as his later works make abundantly clear. And despite its flaws, there's still a lot that can be learned by examining religion through an epidemiological lens. It's just that we need to be careful to keep the weaknesses of our analogies in mind while we do so. Otherwise, you'd end up with a whole swath of people mistaking parables and analogies for reality, and we've seen where that leads.